Cool. So, oh, thank you. Before we get going in today's meeting, for those of you, I'm already going to say, just based on the numbers, that we don't have everyone's survey. So I'm going to, so from previous conversations, and even if you weren't fully present for all of those conversations, we do have a survey to just make sure that we have a real pulse on where folks are with some of these potential recommendations coming out of this group regarding the previous directives. And so we've gotten 9 surveys. Jordan, I'm just looking at
I have
who.
10 survey results.
Oh, we have 10. One just came through. Okay. I'm just trying to figure out if we need to do this. It looks like,
I'm just checking real quick.
sorry, I'm like going back and forth.
I guess could anyone here raise their hand if they haven't filled out the survey? I just want to get as many responses as possible because it's going to help us draft the recommendations we'll present to the large group next week.
Oh, wait,
This is
I do
Sam.
see.
I have not.
Okay, I do see a couple of people. So here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna take 5 minutes. If you've already filled out the survey, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna drop in the policy scan, the medical abuse policy scan that we're gonna be referencing for today's conversation. Y'all can go ahead and refresh. It's the same thing that was sent in the email. If you have not filled out the survey, fill out the survey, and then we'll also have some time to kind of refresh on that document. But that way everybody's doing something right now. And let's just take 5 minutes for that. So here is the survey. So again, only if you have not taken this yet, regarding previous discussions and where folks are for any sort of recommendations.
Hey,
That's the
sorry.
survey.
I'm literally jumping in the car for transport, but I'll do it as soon as I get stationary. This is
Perfect.
Sam.
Okay. And Sam, I can email you that link too. So,
Thanks.
yep. And then the policy scan, for those of you that have completed the survey, is here. And this will just be kind of a regrounding of, like, again, what we're going to be talking about today, what we've found from other states, and then we'll move into that conversation after survey time. So let's take 5 minutes. You're doing either the survey or the policy scan, and then we'll come back and we'll move forward in the conversation. All right? All right.
Trace, this is Rashan. Is there a way to know if you have our numbers? Because I took it last night, but maybe it was late. I'm
No,
just
I've
curious.
got you, Roshan. I've got you.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. All right. So 5 minutes and we'll come back. Tara, I don't have your survey. So if you could complete it, that'd be great. You took the first one, but this is a version 2. I'm gonna give it another minute or two. All right, just so folks know, the responses I have are Zane, Chris, Jennifer, Margaret, Gina, Roshan, Kevin, Ashley, Kathy, Carlos, and Aletha. So if you didn't hear your name, I do not have your survey. All right, I'm gonna move us on. If folks are still filling it out and have not completed it, just want to reference that we're using this to move forward recommendations, potential recommendations to the larger group, where you all have an opportunity to kind of speak to the conversation that was had, the nuances, obviously, in your decision making. But we do have pretty strong majority for a number of those directives. So we'll be giving you all a heads up via email as to like what we're going to be presenting to the larger group. And I would imagine probably ask one or two of you all to kind of join in that discussion, and we can open it up also full group. But the goal would be to bring this back to the larger group to have discussion and for them to really understand like where you all got to and how you got there. So just as a heads up and a reminder of that process. So it is super helpful when you fill out those surveys. So for folks that didn't get a chance to finish it, if you could do that sometime by end of day today, that would be super helpful for us to kind of know where we're headed with the larger group. All right, so with that, we're gonna put that on the shelf and we're gonna move into this new conversation. And for folks that haven't had a chance to, we're gonna bring back the policy scan here in a minute. So I want you to kind of just put that to the side for now. I just wanted to use that time to do that if you didn't have anything else to do. But I'm gonna bring Kathy in to the conversation today, Dr. Wells. So she has agreed, and I really appreciate it, Dr. Wells. This is a really complex topic. We're talking about this idea of medical child abuse. And so task force is charged with analyzing, and I want to underscore the word analyze, as we have kind of in all of these directives, medical child abuse in the process to report medical child abuse. And this, as you know, is an incredibly complex discussion. So just want to hold space for that complexity today. And we've asked Dr. Wells to kind of give a lay of the land of like, where is this conversation currently in the medical professional community? What do you see as the challenges of this group to really be wrestling with? And then really we want you all to be able to jump in, obviously from your own professional and personal perspectives around where you feel like the challenges are. But I thought that Dr. Wells would do a great job of grounding us in what is this conversation? What are the complexities here? And then want to open it up to the full group. So Dr. Wells, really appreciate your willingness to kind of jump in and do some of this groundwork, laying of the land for us, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, thanks, Trace. It is a complex issue. So let me just try to do my best at defining how we, when I say we as a child abuse pediatrician, the medical community, and really all the sort of child and family serving entities that deal with these cases, look at this. So medical child abuse is sort of one term that is used to describe a phenomenon that has been is often called Munchausen syndrome by proxy, or factitious disorder imposed upon another, or fabricated disorder imposed upon another. There's lots of definitions that have been used historically. And so essentially what this is it's really a range of activities that a caregiver, often a parent, may be engaged in. So it's anything from exaggerating an illness. So a child that has an illness, the parent is exaggerating what that illness is and repeatedly seeking medical care, all the way to, another step beyond that would be someone who is sort of seeing things maybe where the medical community doesn't confirm them. So they're seeing different things. They're saying, I think I see a seizure, all the way to, on the other end of the spectrum, the worst end of the spectrum, is someone who's actually inducing illness in a child. So Munchausen syndrome is really the term that was used for an adult doing that to themselves, right? And often it's hard to speak about intent, but it's often seeking repeated medical intervention based on their perception of their own illness by proxy, or what's now been termed medical child abuse, not medical neglect, but medical child abuse, is when someone is doing that to their own child. And again, I just want to sort of underscore part of the complexity is that there's a range, right? So there's a range of behaviors, everything from someone who's exaggerating something they're seeing or frequently seeking medical attention, which part of why it's complex, right, is in our field, we worry when people don't seek medical attention appropriately when there is an illness or an injury. And so the medical community, right, assumes that when a parent or a caregiver seeks care for their child, we have to rely upon history that's provided by the caregiver, because the kid often can't tell us, right? They're too young, they're developmentally not able to. So this sort of, early on, or often, and the way I say early on is oftentimes these behaviors may escalate over time. And that's why it's important as a medical community for us to sort of recognize this behavior and address it so that it doesn't escalate, right? And yet it's really complicated because when this is occurring, oftentimes multiple different medical providers are engaged, specialists, subspecialists in different places. Oftentimes they may not have access to records that occurred in another place. They may not even be aware that medical care was sought. And in our world now, that can be not just in different hospitals in the same community, that can be across the country, and actually potentially even internationally. So this is complicated, right? Because this really requires the medical community or other people to recognize that care is being sought in multiple locations, have access to that information, and then really tease out whether or not there's actually real illness here and the parent is just being a huge advocate for their kid, which certainly can be the case, or there's something else going on that actually would then cross the line into being something that is actually harmful to the child. So regardless of whether it was the parent's illness that's causing them to seek this sort of attention, it's harmful to the child. And so where is that line crossed? And that is really complicated in our community to really understand that. And that often really requires, when I teach about this, I tell my medical colleagues and other professional colleagues that when these cases, they're probably not as rare as we used to think they were. So whether that is that we just weren't catching them, or now that access to social media and GoFundMe accounts and other kinds of activities have escalated the behavior of someone who's seeking some secondary gain or secondary attention. The other thing that I will say is when these things occur, they're often done by someone who's quite skilled. So who really understands the medical system, who understands medical needs, who actually can speak very eloquently about the needs of their child. And so again, that's a good thing, right? We want someone who's really advocating for their child's needs. And so that can really sort of be complicated to the medical community to really understand, is this someone who's actually just advocating for their child, or if they're actually making things up and harming their child. And another thing that's hard about this is that there's confidentiality, right? So so medical records are confidential. We can, as medical professionals, we can confer with other medical professionals for the care of the child, but if those things are not freely shared, we may not even know that those records exist. So really complex issue. Actually, it was interesting when we were talking about this, even just researching it, it's not language that's in our statute currently, and in most other states it's not. In fact, I wasn't even aware that any states had it in their statute till Brian did some good research and Jordan did some good research. So it's and it's a growing awareness in our field in terms of when do you engage, when do you just work with the family to appropriately address and so that they appropriately understand the needs of the child and they appropriately seek care, or when do we need to engage someone who can really provide safety for the child and protection when things are beyond what is appropriate for medical care of a child. So Trace, I don't know if that's this is a complex issue, and one of the things that this is a great group, right? And I'm really anxious to hear what folks' thoughts are. One thing when I was sort of talking with the team about this is I even looked to, we have colleagues on our teams that are actually working in teams with the hospital systems and other places to really try to create policies and practices so that when this becomes a question, I think some of the issues that have come up around this, or when and if reporting should occur, and who can pull that trigger. And I honestly think we've dealt with that really, really well in this task force, right? Like any medical provider is a mandatory reporter when you have a question. I mean, that's a separate issue that I really feel like we've addressed really well. But I think this question of medical child abuse alone, and whether there could be, statutory changes and all those sort of things, I almost said, gosh, I would love to have more time with a group that really could even dig in deeper, and whether there's capacity and time on this task force to do that or not. I think it was one of those questions was like, can we give some really strong conversation here and then pose this to a group that maybe could even spend a little more time on this and really because I think just in a couple of hours, this is a really complex issue to try to tackle with what I think it probably deserves in terms of attention. So that's just my thought, but I'm open to I'm really anxious to hear, because I think many of you have different roles in these cases, and these are challenging.
Thanks, Dr. Wells, for that kind of, here's where we as medical professionals see the unique challenges of this topic. I think when we talked kind of earlier this morning, just around what this conversation really is getting at as it relates to the directive, we kind of talked about, is there like a tipping point, of the spectrum that Kathy referenced of, the complexity here is that there's different behaviors, there's different challenges, et cetera. And so the challenge is, where's the sweet spot as it relates to like statute around the spectrum of entry points, and like, what is the tipping point for a medical professional? Because it's not if they should be a mandatory report in this case. We know that this group already believes yes. It's more, noting that complexity of that and how to engage in recognizing the relationships of families and all the things that this group has been challenged by. So
hey, Trace, can I say one more thing that I think I need to mention? Yeah.
Please.
I think one of the hard questions is, right? So one might say, well, anytime you have any question at all that someone is, inappropriately seeking care, should that be reported? or do you have to absolutely know for sure, and this is a diagnosis, and we know the way the statute's written is reasonable suspicion, right? When I train to other medical providers, you don't have to prove, you don't have to be 100% sure. It has to have a reasonable suspicion. I think it's really challenging in medical child abuse, right? So where is that line? Like, where's that tipping point? Where's that line, right? Is it this parent seems to be coming in a lot for her kids or his kids' ear infections, right? And seeking a lot of care, or is it someone who is really saying that things are occurring that we've not been able to confirm in the medical community? And I think that's a challenging question. And personally, I don't want it to all necessarily rest with me either, right? I mean, this is a team sport when you talk about these issues, right? It's all of us sort of working together. But I think that's hard, right? Because if I said every time someone has any question or any inkling, it has to be reported. I mean, I'm not saying that you couldn't, right? Because that's certainly your mandate, right? As a mandatory reporter, or anybody can do that. But is that the best timing, right, in terms of really supporting a family and a kiddo that's struggling? So I think this is a really challenging issue. I wish there was a really bright line that helped us with that.
Thanks, Kathy. You're going to go to Ashley, then Jennifer, then Roshan.
Sorry, guys, I'm driving, so I hope you can hear me okay. I was wondering if we have any data about whether or not there's big disparities in reporting this, like we've seen in other areas. So, for example, like, is this more likely to be reported for a Black family or something like that? Because I'm just trying to wrap my head around what the challenge is here, and I'm curious. I didn't see anything like that in our research that we were given.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think at the work of this group trying to center the disproportionate impacts, like, are we clear on what the challenge is in that unique lens? Kathy, did you want to say
Boy,
anything?
that's a really good question. I will tell you, in my experience, I feel like those disparities play out so much more frequently in neglect kind of settings. Quite frankly, these cases, not always, but these cases are often someone who is quite savvy, really knows medical systems, often, not to paint a picture for everyone, but it's often someone who may actually have some medical knowledge, maybe had worked in the medical system. Now, having said that, I have to think about all the cases I've experienced, and many of them were, quite frankly, people with a lot of means, right? May really look like the great parents, right? Now, does that play into why sometimes these things can maybe get to a point before they get reported because they're so believable and convincing? It's almost sort of the reverse, right? That and it's a great question, because I don't know that I've ever seen data about disproportionality in reporting in this population.
Well, because what I'm really thinking of is not so much where it is happening, is the parent that is advocating for a child but being accused of it, but really there is something wrong, because you talked about that other side. And that's where I wonder if there's some disparities or some things to be careful of, that maybe are families that come from our disparate communities being accused of this sort of falsely, or being suspicious, people being suspicious of them when in fact they're actually trying to advocate.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question. I would love to see that data. If it's
Yeah, we could
I've not heard it discussed at all in our field.
I'm making a note of it, Ashley, that we can have folks dig in and see, does that exist? Obviously, the policy scan of, like, what exists in statute is very minimal, because this is an issue that a lot of states are not tackling, or at least have not tackled yet. So I'm not sure about the data piece. That's a great question, but we can come back to that. Jennifer, and then I want to make sure Roshan jumps in, and then Gina.
Unmute first. There we go. I'm really struggling with this sort of tension, I think, between pathologizing the parent, or, the parent as the person with the, I'm going to say, disordered behavior, for lack of a better word to come up with, versus a real focus on how is this impacting the child. And, because certainly this can go in a lot of different directions. And there are times where, as you mentioned, Dr. Wells, there's parents who actively create symptoms in their child, or do things to the child that result in symptoms. And then I'm also thinking about how this overlaps with a parent's trauma history, and how it might overlap with, it seems to be, in my mind anyway, really similar to this pattern that I have seen an awful lot, and I'm sure Rashan and Gina can speak to this too, that a parent who has been a victim of sexual abuse as a child sees signs of that in their own child, and then the system really focuses on, oh, this parent is just acting out their own trauma. There's nothing going on with this child. It's this parent that is behaving badly. I'm not sure where I'm going with this. But I just am like, I struggle with using Munchausen by proxy at all. I think that's just really puts the focus in the wrong place. And think there's just as you said, like there's a lot to unpack here. This shows up for a lot of reasons in a lot of different ways. And yeah, it's a complicated topic.
Yeah,
So-
Jennifer, I would say you nailed it, because this is the debate we've had in our field. This is why some of my colleagues sort of renamed it medical child abuse. Because even if there is a component of pathology in the parent, and there really is, right? Like that's something that needs to be addressed. And the question is, what's the impact on the child, right? And so we've actually literally, I've been in a debate where one side is saying this is a pathology of the parent, and the other says this is about the child, right? And the answer is yes, both are true. And at what point is that? And the reason this medical child abuse terminology has taken on a little bit of weight in our field is because it really does say that there's an impact to the child that needs to be addressed in terms of protection and safety. It could be done at the same time that someone is addressing what's going on for the parent. But yes, I think you nailed it.
Roshan?
Oh, sorry, I thought I took my hand down. I was gonna ask the same question about data. And I had in my mind, I mean, I know we have data around like the way that Black women get treated in medical care and are like often disbelieved when they have pain or report symptoms, things like that. So that was in my mind, and I was thinking about like who we believe when they're advocating for their kids. So I think we've already covered it. So.
All right, cool. Thanks. Gina and then Aletha.
Yeah, I think I'm probably going to repeat some of the things that were already said, but I also want to speak to this from just from a personal experience in navigating those pieces, and also want to lift up the historical and generational traumas that many folks from communities of color carry with them, specifically Black and Native women, in that, the health care professionals have been the abusers in our past. Even currently, you literally have to fight for every single thing when you go in for care. You get totally told that, like, that's not what I said. That's not what I told you to do. I mean, you're blamed for your own illnesses and why you're seeking care. When you bother to advocate for yourself, which you have to do, it's a requirement. You have to speak for yourself. Then you're seen as combative. You're seen as, well, what are you getting so upset for? Then it becomes suspicion. It's a very quick and slippery slope of all of the aspects that we were charged with to talk about and address with this. And I don't know that like picking up and trying to move around language is really tending to these issues. I want to say that piece. I mean, right up to like, I have to check, like when I was caring for my mother, I had to check her pills for her. because we had been given wrong pills before and were labeled differently on the bottle. I had to look this up. I had to look through a medical book. I had to look up pictures of these pills so that way I could know I'm not going crazy. Brought it back and they're like, oh, sorry about that. Here you go. And then I'm supposed to just be like, oh, they fixed it. No, I still have to check that. So I'm saying that to say that like there's such a very exhausting, like traumatic impact to communities of color who navigate these things. And then you fold in my child. I don't have children. And probably thankfully too, like my doctors here that I don't, because if they think I'm a nightmare, I would be such a nightmare for my children because I don't trust them to care for me. And now I have to trust in you to care for my child. I have to like fight for you to like believe everything that I'm saying to you. And now fold into the fact that like now if I advocate too loudly or too much or too articulately, now I probably am creating these things and probably medically abusing my child. Like, and the resources and support that I have around me as a woman of color, a Native woman in a tribal community, further and further like removes me from, you know, from supportive aspects that I'm just trying to keep me and my family safe. And I think that there's just way too much in here. It's like, we want you to advocate for yourself, but also don't be too articulate in that. Don't know too much. Don't get too specific. Don't read up too much about that because now it's going to look like you're being suspicious. I think we're just adding way too many more like barriers and like red flags that we're learning about more and more every day that are like not correct, that we are assessing for the wrong things. And I also want to lift up the person who provided public comments earlier in these meetings who mentioned that her experiences with being charged with these things. And it's very troubling to me that our medical professionals, who I think some of us hope are like the last stop of like, these guys should be able to assess for this. And I appreciate that there's honesty here around, hey, it's even complex for us. That's great to hear. Also, probably very discouraging for someone like that mother who had shared their experience around this, that like it was said with not only such certainty, but like action brought against this mother, and who was also experiencing other you know, domestic violence and things like that. And now potentially that child has been placed in the care of the abuser in the situation. So my point is, those things that we're assessing for are still riddled with all of those biases and prejudices that we're supposed to be like centering here. And I also want to like mention that it's been mentioned throughout all of this work we've been doing that it doesn't feel like we're centering these pieces. It's coming in as an afterthought. And I appreciate that y'all are gonna like look for that data. And I don't know that you'll find it, because I don't know that there are many avenues that are safe for folks to report that like, hey, I've been treated this badly because of my race in trying to seek care. And much like a lot of the, you know, the many things that folks face that way. So I just want to lift that up because I don't want us to forget about those aspects and get caught up in this like language work we're trying to do here. Thank you.
Yeah, and Gina, I really appreciate your kind of willingness and vulnerability of sharing the both the challenges you see on behalf of the communities you're referencing and also your personal experience. I want to make sure I'm understanding the piece you're saying about the language and your concerns there. So kind of what you're saying is for this group to move on any sort of statute call out as it relates to medical child abuse feels concerning due to the complexities of the biases that you're referencing as well. Like that's the kind of crux for you that you're referencing, which is like if we hone in on like a policy change or a recommendation around a statute shift that doesn't like address the actual like underlying challenges for these communities. Is that, I'm like summarizing? I just want to make sure I'm like understanding what the big block there.
Yeah, I just don't want us to forget about that as we do like wordsmithing here. I just don't want us to forget about those aspects of it. And I get I get what you're saying. I don't know how we fold that in that way, but I just feel like we'll be right back at this same issue. Should we continue to like push these aspects off to the sides? But yeah. You're getting what I'm cooking, Trace, I think.
Yeah. Thanks, Gina. I appreciate you. Aletha and Stephanie.
Yeah, I believe Dr. Wells said that the statute reads that a medical professional has to have a suspicion of medical child abuse. Is that correct?
Well, so there's nothing in the statute around medical child abuse, but in general, it's a suspicion of abuse or neglect, right? So the statute doesn't call out medical child abuse alone. And in my experience, there's more of a concern that this gets a long ways down the path with the child being in a lot of harm before it gets reported, because the parent is quite convincing along the way in terms of this really being an illness when it doesn't really exist.
Right.
Yeah.
And so in my experience, I've been doing child protection for a little over 10 years. We've had 2 cases where it would be considered medical child abuse. And in both instances, it was a meth psychosis of the parent who would see parasites coming from their child's anuses and other orifice and in their feces and things of that nature. And so that was pretty easy to discern that it was not anything medically wrong with the child, right? And I think that with any other of the really Munchausen by proxy parents who have that savvy and knowledge and are attention seeking in that manner, I think that it needs to be more than a suspicion, because what's going to happen if it is reported, we're still going to have that medical aspect that of a confirmation. So I think that there needs to be some more onus on medical professionals to say that this is more likely than not happening, and more than just a suspicion of, because we're still going to have it irregardless if we assign it or not, right? And so yeah, that's all.
Which is interesting, because if you look at the data that was pulled, that's what Arkansas's language says, right?
Right.
Right, because who's to say, let me give you an example, seizures. A parent might say, my child is having seizures. And as a medical person, I have to take the history that's provided to me and use that as a basis of my intervention, right? Diagnosis and treatment. Now, it is a piece. Seizures, for example, not all show up on an EEG. So for those of you that, may have had, we do an EEG, we do some assessment, we do some studies to try to confirm that a seizure is there. And it doesn't always show up. So we have to trust that what the parent is telling us. And so at some point down the road, if it becomes less clear that there's actually a seizure, and that someone's saying that, right? So we might put them in the hospital, we might observe them, we might put them, where we can watch and see if a seizure really occurs. We're talking about something where someone may make that up, or actually then, inject something into the child to cause them to be ill. So this is a really, and yes, it is very, and that's part of why I think we wanted to bring that up, is that it really does require, and just the current medical team may not be enough, right? Because they may not be all the ones to put the dots together. So we as child abuse pediatricians often get consulted, or I would actually advocate should be consulted, because we can then try to help put those dots together as to whether this is really existing or is someone actually fabricating it. So
Right.
Thank you for saying that.
Right. And I think that goes a long way with all other types of abuses that a lot of medical professionals report, say that they have, this is non-accidental trauma. Well, if you are a medical professional not trained in child abuse and you have not consulted anybody else, I don't think ethically, you should be making that assertion that this is non-accidental trauma if you don't have that training.
So again, it's challenging. I'm just going to throw out, right? Because there are 6 child abuse pediatricians in the state of Colorado. We have trained, we have developed a network and trained providers in communities. And technically, as a pediatrician or a physician, I should be trained on bruising patterns that are that are consistent with abuse, right? And so because we have some basic training in that, one could argue, should a child abuse pediatrician see every kid with a bruise that is consistent with a slap mark? Or is recognizing a slap mark pattern abusive? Is that enough to say, look, I trained, I know that this is a slap mark, that's something that should be reported. So you're right. I think for the really complex type things, I think there are some basic things that probably do make sense, right? But when we're talking about medical child abuse, this is something that is really quite involved and complex and probably does need to have the eyes. And the question is that prior to reporting or is that after reporting, right? So when I would also tell, my DHS friends, if you get a referral on a case like this, I would really hope you would reach out to one of us medical folks to help you discern, is this really someone who's just advocating for their sick child or what they think is a sick child, or is it really someone who's crossed that line?
Oh, we have Denver children on speed dial, believe me.
Thanks for that. Stephanie, and then Zane and Ashley. And then I kind of want to, I want to make sure that we're looking directly back at this directive too, to ensure that we're getting at the crux of what the directive is asking us to. So this is a super helpful conversation, and obviously helpful for us to capture just like what you all are wrestling with as well. So Stephanie, go ahead.
Yeah, Kathy, I have a couple questions. One is there an official medical diagnosis such as like this medical abuse, as we're calling it now, right? Not Munchausen. I know that is an official diagnosis, but okay, so that's my first question. But then I guess my second question for this group, and first I just want to thank Gina. I really found your comments to be really important and frankly spot on. I guess when it comes back to the mandatory reporting issue here, right? I'm a little confused because in no other profession on that list of mandated reporters do we ask them to report a certain thing, right? And yet here, the idea anyway in general is that somehow doctors, it's not enough that you're a mandated reporter, you now have to report a certain diagnosis or a certain thing. And it feels almost like, why? Right? We don't say dentist must report some, I mean, right? In other words, if a dentist sees injuries in a child's mouth, right? They're going to report that depending on what they think. I guess what I'm just confused about is the directive, because I'm a little like, doctors are required to report. If they see that a child is harmed, they report that harm, and whether that harm is inflicted directly, say broken leg, broken arm, whatever, burn marks, or if they believe that child is being subject to, say, over medication, isn't that just part of an overall job? So I don't know, maybe I'm simplifying things too much. And Jen, I appreciated when you said, I don't know where I'm going with this, but that's kind of where I am right now. But I almost just feel like it's an important discussion. Don't get me wrong. It just feels like, aren't we as a community of states, of a world, entering into this really nuanced area within a very specific mandatory reporter category? And what is the merits of doing that? And then to Gina's point, what is the disadvantage of doing that?
Thanks, Stephanie. I reshared the, actually I don't think I shared it in this group yet, but I shared from the task force statute, the definition that we are referencing. Like when we say, again, we're not, batting around like what is as far as like what we're defined as medical child abuse here. Jordan, I don't know if you want to step in and give any context on this, but I just want to make sure that, yeah.
Yeah, as best I can, because this was, to everyone's point, a very complicated issue when it came up in statute. There were obviously concerns, to Dr. Wells' point, increasingly you're seeing cases like this in social media and the media. And so that was really the legislator's intention of putting it in the bill. But in drafting the recommendation, we also recognized we had to narrow it in to exactly what Stephanie was just talking about, to this specific criteria that fits within the mandatory reporting scope. Which is why we kind of have, at least for the consideration of the task force, what the legislators envisioned was medical abuse, specifically when you're receiving that unnecessary or harmful medical care, that intentional care that unnecessary care or treatment that Dr. Wells referenced. So when it comes to what the directive is really asking, it's what are the processes or procedures around when there is a suspicion that abuse or neglect happened in this form, in the definition that Trace just put into the chat. Now, all this is, as Trace said, really helpful for us to frame the conversation and demonstrate where this task force is worried about, both in disparities and in the broader sense. But if that helps, that was kind of the narrow lane they tried to give us in the directive. I'm not saying it's perfect, but that was the intention behind providing this definition.
Which comes back to that kind of tipping point thing, right? So what the processes or procedures as it relates to this definition, what is the tipping point of entry into a report, or someone referenced, like, might there be a second opinion? Like, is that something that this group is interested in? So so we're not trying to like steer you away from the broader conversation around the disparities piece, but I think also just making sure that we're touching on what this directive is really getting at, which is this, like, these processes, procedures piece. So a lot of hands raised, which I'm loving. So and also just want to name, I just appreciate folks holding space for the messiness of this conversation. Just coming back to the original point, which is this very complex and there's so many different layers. And obviously we're trying to make sure we get to the directive piece, and we also want to hold space for just these broader, very relevant concerns and questions and where the group is. So Zane and then Ashley.
Thank you. Yeah, this has been a great discussion. One thing that comes to mind, though, for me and in my 30-year career in child welfare arenas is the investigative piece. And I think when I was listening to Dr. Wells kind of talk about some of the things and some of the concerns, the times that I've had to investigate cases when I was a caseworker and these kind of allegations came up, I was really the only person that had the ability to go and investigate how many doctors were being seen, how many times the pharmacy was visited by a parent. I don't think doctors really are out there doing their own investigations around this. So that makes it even more complicated is what's the mechanism then? Because these cases do happen. So I don't know that we're arguing that whether these cases happen or not. I think, disparity is certainly an issue. The times that I've been involved in investigating, like Dr. Wells said, it is usually people of means. The ones that I've investigated, they were Caucasian families that, particularly moms with a lot of medical kind of education. It was very odd. These cases were concerning. And that's why I kind of liked Michigan's piece. To Kevin's point about, are we just creating more suspicions? I feel like Michigan's was just a little more inclusive as it related to medical neglect, or medical abuse that we're seeing, where children are coming in contact with fentanyl and overdosing accidentally, and those kinds of things. When I think of medical abuse, that's all encompassing, not just the Munchausen thing, because I do think Munchausen's in and of itself is fairly rare. And so, I don't want to make the statute more complicated, but I would like to make sure that we don't overlook that there's a investigative piece when it comes to particularly Munchausen that can't be overlooked, that it has to go somewhere, and it has to go to an entity that has the ability to, get past confidentiality and HIPAA and really look at all of the pieces that are involved with making sure that a child isn't subjected to the parents' mental health struggles, if you will. So that's the only piece that I kind of wanted to bring to the table, is we still need that mechanism, and is a change to the statute the appropriate way to make sure that investigators can do that.
Thanks for that, Zane. Ashley, go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking a little bit along the same lines as Stephanie, is kind of confused a little bit about why this directive was given to us. I think that Dr. Wells has maybe helped me understand it a little bit more, that it sounds like there's some concern that this goes on too long before it gets reported because it's so nebulous and the parameters are not good. But I got to tell you, I have had these cases as a legal advocate. I have overseen other attorneys in my role now who have these cases, and I like, it's a hot mess. It is clear as mud when you are, and I don't think getting the department involved in is necessarily the most helpful, because the caseworkers, the attorneys, they don't understand it. They're relying on the doctors, outside of the piece Zane named of maybe just being able to gather information from different places. I don't know how helpful, to be honest, it is in a lot of instances when DHS is involved, because these issues are just so nebulous. It almost makes me think that what we really need is better guidance for the doctors, but not through mandatory reporting. It kind of gives Dr. Wells's idea of having a more intensive group take a deep dive at this make more sense to me, because I think this is beyond the scope of just mandatory reporting, personally, just listening to it. Because I also really, like I said before, have a fear that if we put something in statute, we might be adding or creating issues we didn't intend to when it comes to our Black and brown communities.
Yeah, and Ashley, I'm seeing a lot of head nods and then also some references in the chat too. I think I want to make sure that we kind of wrestle out of like what folks are kind of, or we think about what folks are wrestling with now, and then I'll kind of pivot us into this idea of, Chris's, to use Chris's words, a bigger issue than we can have access to implement and or change. What would a recommendation look like? Like, what would you want to see from a group that we're kind of referencing? Like, what do you want to ensure that group would be considering? Who would you want to make sure is at the table in that sort of group, right? I'm guessing that Dr. Wells, you have some ideas that might be different from Roshan, who's like, well, let's not, so I think we could also spend a little bit of time talking about, if that were the recommendation from this group, to say, hey, here are the things that we were wrestling with. And we also think that this is a much more complex conversation than we have time with in our 2 hours. And so here's what we would recommend for a group to continue the conversation. So we could go down that avenue as well. Sam, Jill, and then Stephanie.
All right. Let me just raise your hand or shake your head if you can't hear me. But my thing was, I'm not a medical person at all. I raised a child with special needs for 5 years who was mostly nonverbal. And because of that,
Sam cut out for me. Did she cut out for other folks? Okay. Sam, you cut out. Let's try again once you're back to a.
oh,
All right, I'm gonna move us on to Jill. Sam, maybe shoot me a note in the chat when you're ready to jump back in. I want to make sure we get to you. Jill, go ahead, and then Stephanie.
I've had a few of these cases. I agree with Ashley on the lack of clarity. No, very few slam dunks. I think, I want to be respectful of people who've had to navigate these personally. I've only had to navigate them professionally. I don't love making any change in a statute based on outlying cases that get in the media and get attention, get the legislators' attention. And so they think that it's like a global issue. I don't see how we change anything related to medical professionals making reports to the hotline. I do want to note that when a medical professional, like a child abuse pediatrician, is the one to make a hotline report, I do think that holds a lot of weight. compared to if family members, or even like if I made the report. I feel like a medical professional, woof, that's if they're once they say those words like factitious disorder by proxy, Munchausen's, I mean, that's going to get DHS's attention 120%. And very tricky for poor parents to ever defend themselves against those cases because all the child abuse pediatricians are kind of working together. And we often actually have to go out of state to even get somebody who would even look at the records when a child abuse pediatrician is the one, making that call and getting that case going, and have that you often results in DHS filing a case. But I would prefer like I don't even know. I read the charge. I read the direct that, the legislator wanted us to cover. And like, my thing is, I don't think we need to change anything related to this issue. But if there are people who could do a deeper dive with more, content knowledge, I would support that.
Thanks, Jill. Stephanie?
Yeah, I just want to, I guess, really sort of, echo what Jill is saying. I don't want to kick the can down the road for the sake of saying we did something, right? Yeah, let's study it and let some other folks pick this up in a year. If that isn't what we think, right? And again, I respect that I may be in the minority here. So I just feel that without data, and this again goes to Jill's point, without data, without a firm agreement, even in the medical community, how do you legislate? And then if you do, you're legislating to the one or two sensational stories that have been raised a year. And I echo what Carlos says, which is, I do have confidence in our doctors and our law enforcement and our DA communities. I mean, I worked in this world, for 15 years, and I had a couple of these cases, and I worked with my doctors and my law enforcement, and we handled the 2 or 3 we saw. So I just feel like, are we looking for, what is that phrase? We're looking for a solution without knowing the problem, or that sort of thing. So my personal feeling is, I think our group can go many ways, but one is, in light of these conversations and delineate what they are, we don't see that it is this group's role, period, to go down the road, and then period, leave it at that. Or you could say, we don't have enough information and we think somebody else needs to go pick this up. I'm personally in favor of the former, not the latter, based on this conversation and the lack of information that we possess about the problem right now.
Thanks, Stephanie. Kathy, you want to jump in?
Yeah, this has been a great conversation. As I've sat here and sort of thought about this and listened, as to whether or not this question of whether or not another group should take this up, and what question are we asking? I will say, for whatever it's worth, I don't think that anybody that in my shoes, or medical professionals, even that are not child abuse pediatricians, if they think that this is happening, I'm not aware of anybody that says that wouldn't be something I would report, right? I think that trying to put something in statute, is that going to make medical people who are maybe on the subspecialist side and can get kind of immersed in working with the family around one particular issue and not thinking that this could be medical child abuse, is that going to make them do their job differently? No. This is something, and I really appreciate Carlos's last comment is, and everyone's more recent comments, Stephanie, and that, what is the real problem here? And if the question is, are these cases occurring and somehow getting missed, putting language in statute isn't probably going to help that, and it may have unintended consequences. Because I don't know of anyone at least in the healthcare profession, and probably in even child welfare or legal or whatever, that if people think that this is happening, that they wouldn't think that it was grounds for report. So there's nothing in the statute that would preclude it, right? That would not have it encompassed in current language. And I don't think adding language necessarily is going to provide further clarity. So I might even be withdrawing my suggestion of does another group need to study this, right? Because the question is, what is this, right? What is the question people are, I think there have been times when people feel like this got down the path too far before something happened, but I'm not sure that that's a problem for us to solve, right? That's probably education, that's probably awareness, that's probably systems issues, right?
Yeah, someone referenced, like, I think it was Kevin, it was like, is this really an issue around like I think you used like hospital policy as the example of like versus a change in statute sort of thing, like where is the most appropriate shift, if there is a shift, in language and procedure. So Kevin, I'm sorry if I misquoted you. Someone said hospital policy as the example in the chat. I'll have to go look. Jennifer, let's come to you, and then I want to we don't have to keep circling there sounds like there's some consensus here, kind of, and I want to kind of tease out, Stephanie, I'm going to use your example of like the group, this kind of recommendation of like a continued group versus not, right? It seems clear. Well, Jennifer, you go first, and then we'll come back to where I think I'm seeing some consensus, and then let's tease that out a little bit. And we don't need to keep, we have some other things we can kind of go back to in previous conversations with our remaining time, if that's where folks want to go. So, so Jennifer, why don't you go ahead, and then let's come back to this kind of like question and just see where folks are at.
Well, I put my hand up right before Dr. Wells made the statement about this might be more of a training issue, because it does seem like those sensational cases, the cases that Stephanie's talking about, are ones where doctors are not identifying this issue. They're not seeing it. So changing the statute around mandatory reporting doesn't address that at all. So I think this is, Stephanie, I think you were trying to say it's a solution in search of a problem. And this isn't going to solve the failure of medical professionals to identify medical child abuse. So yeah, I'm starting to see this that way as well, that this really is not a fit for us. We cannot address this because this is not a mandatory reporting problem.
I guess my question to you all is, with the policy scan that was provided, is there anything in there? I know that someone referenced, maybe it was Zane, Michigan, that you kind of like the inclusive piece, but is there anything in the policy scan that you're like, there are only a couple of states that are tackling this in any sort of way, and you could, I don't know why it's only a couple of states, but you could probably infer, because of the complexity of this topic, that it would be more challenging to put it in statute. So is there anything that anybody wants to say as it relates to the policy scan where you see that as like, oh yes, like, wow, the fact that X state has this in statute, Colorado should be a little bit more bold in this? Or it seems like y'all are all pretty, I don't want to use the word uninspired, but no one's like, oh man, like, look at what this state is doing. Am I reading that correctly? Am I reading the room right? Sam?
I was just going to say, I appreciate Pennsylvania because it names it as a type of child abuse, rather than separating it as this whole other issue. I think that's important.
Sorry, Sam, can you say that one more time? I want to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying. The state.
I appreciated Pennsylvania because it says one form of child abuse is this, rather than trying to separate it into its own category, which I think makes the most sense of like an umbrella rather than just a separate, more serious thing.
Gotcha. Gina?
I don't want to take us off into another tangent, but I just wondered, is child sexual abuse supposed to just be assumed in child abuse in terms of what we're seeing here, or are those in a is that a whole different
That's a whole different. I think I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Say it again.
Are you
Well,
asking?
I guess is this included in there? Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
Sexual, and I'm sorry, was that Gina? I'm having trouble catching. Great, thank you. My screen
Yeah.
is divided up. Gina, are you asking if sexual abuse is considered part of medical abuse, or is it a standalone condition to be reported? Is that
Yes.
what you're asking?
Yeah.
It is a definite standalone condition. And in fact, if you go into the statute, part of my criticism of the reporting statute is you actually have to cross-reference literally 3 other statutes to understand what abuse is being reported or needs to be reported. But if you go in there, it does list or refer us to the criminal code, which then goes on to list another 23 specific criminal violations, which include a variety of sexual abuse, trafficking, and so forth. So yes, it is a standalone item that if a mandated reporter cross-references all those items, it would be listed in and of itself. It doesn't have to be assumed, if you will, through a medical definition.
Okay. Okay, that's helpful. Also, that's a whole other complex box I'm not going to unleash on us, but yeah. Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Gina. Zane, go ahead.
So just for clarification purposes for what we do today, and I think I do think that maybe adding this to the statute could potentially cause some other problems. I mean, I'm all for clarifying statutes. I think that's what some of the problems we've run into with our child abuse statute is the ambiguity of some of it. But I also think that we could make things a little more difficult if we go down this road. So what is our response to the legislators then? How do we kind of wrap our minds around, leaving it out? So it's because cases are still happening. There's still, I mean, we're still investigating those situations. There's still room in our statute to address these issues without calling them out specifically for medical providers. So then it was that really the legislators' intent in asking us to analyze this further? I guess I'm still kind of in the dark. Was it just these high profile cases? Was it just, I mean, how do we circle back and just say, we feel like our statute is inclusive enough that we trust our medical professionals enough to say, we already have this mechanism in place? Am I capturing that?
Yeah, Zane, great question. Stephanie, do you want to jump in with?
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts. So one, at least in my experience, and I would love to know what others think. In my experience in the high profile cases, right, which I've actually been fairly involved with, the issue was about hospital reporting policies. And how reports of medical child abuse never made the light of day until it was frankly too late. We addressed the notion of delegating one's responsibility to make a mandatory report in one of our other charges. I see these things, at least in my experience, as connected. And as I recall, as a task force, we agreed, I think, that there should not be delegation powers. And Jordan, look at me if I'm wrong. She's nodding that I'm good. And so, at least in my experience, and I think as a task force name, I think it would be authentic to say the issue of medical child abuse is twofold, right? It is the process by which such abuse gets reported, and it's the diagnosis. As it relates to the process by which it is reported, the issue of delegation came up, right? And the issue of whether hospitals can make their own policies, including delegation, came up. And the task force said, no, they cannot delegate. We can't force administrators to take on those onuses. Why? Because cases fall through the cracks in hospitals. That is how we addressed the issue versus going into the medical diagnosis and trying to put that in law and requiring doctors to report this very specific medical diagnosis, which we do with no other professional group, I might add, right? that's how I see the two issues. I see that we have addressed the concerns through this other directive, at least in addressing the circumstances that I have seen, which have been completely procedural lapses within big organizations. That's just my perception.
Stephanie, can I just ask you a question for clarification? When you when you just said the diagnosis, that being the other side, what diagnosis are you talking about? Are you talking about whether the parents are diagnosed with the caregiver has Munchausen and that's the diagnosis for them, or are you talking about them in search of a diagnosis for the child?
I'm talking about them in search of a diagnosis for the child, because when I look at these other states that in our research, basically, as I see it, most of those states are trying to lay out who is qualified to make the diagnosis. One, right? You have to be a certified medical professional, et cetera. And two, it gives brief criteria about what doctors need to see before they can report, which goes to, right? It's kind of like, my friend Kathy always explains medical things to me in ways I can understand. But let's just take a child with a broken leg. We don't say in statute, if you see swelling with corresponding bruising and an inconsistent story that matches the injury that the child is alleged to, then doctors must report X. I see the other state examples as doing something similar, right? If you see A, B, and C, and if you're qualified, then you make a diagnosis. I don't think we mandated reporting systems should be in the business of getting into people's diagnosis of the problem. And in this case, Zane, it would be harm to a child who meets certain criteria. And so that's why I keep coming back to the problems I've seen in the medical arena have stemmed from this other place, at least in my experience, and others here may have different experiences, in which case, please, let's talk about that, because maybe we do have a twofold problem, and I'm simplifying it to one procedural issue that I believe we've addressed. Does that answer your question, Zane?
Would anybody disagree? Because I think, Stephanie, you're kind of summarizing it well as far as what we've sort of wrestled with. I know, Kathy, you kind of came in and said, I think a group should be exploring this, but I'm curious. I kind of want to pick on you first, Kathy, with you're like, maybe I am recusing that recommendation based on how we're drawing out the difference between mandatory reporting versus a need for policy procedure of, institutions that are treating and diagnosing, et cetera. So, yeah, Kathy, I'm curious, where are you at with this? And then anybody else as well.
So I think I am sort of, I think if we can come up with a response that meets the mandate that this group was asked to do, I think for me, the thought of should this be a group having a much bigger discussion was really along the lines of, do we need to put something in statute or not? I think based on this conversation, if we can give a response that meets the expectation of the legislature in what this group was tasked to do, which is aligned with what Stephanie, I think, just outlined, I am good with that, because I don't think that this is something that necessarily is going to be resolved or statutorily outside of what we've already recommended, right? All the recommendations that we have had around causing a report to be made and who's responsible and training of mandatory reporters and all those things, I think have really, to me, addressed the issue that I think the legislature was hoping to address around this particular issue.
Yeah, Kathy, I think that's right. I'm curious, does anybody see it differently? I just want to make sure I'm giving everybody an opportunity to I'm just based on the vibe of the group, what I'm seeing in the chat and the head nods, feels like there's some alignment of clarifying, kind of similar to how Stephanie sort of summarized it as far as the groups, I'd say as far as, Jordan, I'm curious from your perspective, what the directive is saying is the analysis piece. This group came, you asked questions, we had a discussion, and very quickly identified that this is not really a mandatory reporting mechanism, as far as what the challenge is. I'm not saying it's not a challenge, but that is this where that lives, and sounding like folks are saying no. But Jordan, would you
I would agree. You know, the stem for the directive is to analyze. And I think that this group has done that in full. I think that we've actually addressed, to what several people have said, the appropriate questions within the scope of mandatory reporting previously. That's institutional reporting, delegation, duplicative reporting. I mean, honestly, you could thread this discussion through about 6 other directives we worked through.
Mhm.
So I think we fully addressed the recommendation. I just wanted to share that I don't want this group to fear that this conversation then will be lost in the final report, because it won't, because the discussions of disparity, the discussions of the information we lack to even look at this, you know, particularly Gina, a lot of the points that you made, we're still going to capture on that report. So um, it's not an and or, it's an and both. I think we can address the directive as the group is proposing and still highlight the issues around this through the narrative of the report as well. But in terms of recommendation, Trace, it would just help me in terms of writing if we could do just like a very loose straw poll or a follow-up survey of, we're happy to kind of come back and say we've analyzed it and feel that the appropriate points have been addressed in earlier directives. And I'm happy to do that as straw poll or through a survey, but just because of the quick turnaround we have before next week, it might be easier to do it here than to send out another survey.
Yeah. So, so Jordan, I think just I'm thinking of feedback that we've received earlier of like wanting to be crystal clear on like what we're asking folks to vote on. What I would love to do is, Jordan, if you're comfortable writing up a quick what the question is that we're asking for the poll as it relates to what we'll put in the report. And while you're doing that, I'm going to actually skip us back to our survey, because I just want to share out with folks where we're at with previous conversations. And that'll give you a few minutes to put in language. I just know before I'm thinking, Roshan, you've been like, I just want to make sure I'm clear on what exactly you're asking us. So if we could put that in the chat,
Yep,
then
let me do that
very
right now.
clear, and this is what we're asking, yay or nay, and then you kind of feel confident in what you're voting on there. And again, the vote is not on a recommendation. The vote is just kind of like, this is where the group is and what you're comfortable with us kind of moving forward with as it relates to capturing the narrative of this conversation, versus some hard recommendation of a statute change, etc. So, are you cool with that, Jordan? Can you type up? Okay, cool. All right, so pressing pause on this conversation while Jordan puts together a quick question. I just wanted to share, and we'll share this via email as well, but when we come back to the full group to say, this is where the group landed as it relates to specialized occupations recommendations to date, I am gonna share out just where folks are, just so you all have a heads up. So we received 12 responses. I know, Jill, thanks for, we'll get yours in later as well. So here are the responses. Again, question 1, you asked, would you support the following recommendation as written? Task force recommends amending statute to allow for extended reporting timeframes for mandatory reporters who are creating a safety plan for victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking to ensure the safety of the victim and the victim's family or members while creating the safety plan. In these instances, mandatory reporters will be required to make a report within 72 hours. So you can see the percentages here, 83.3% yes, and 16.7% no. Here are the additional comments folks were making, which we will also make note of as it relates to the larger group. And again, the larger group will be asked the same question so that we can see where the consensus drives, but this will push these questions and recommendations to the larger group. All right, moving on. Question 2 that was asked as it relates to Directive 11, would you support the following recommendation? Task force recommends amending statute to modify mandatory reporting requirements for mandatory reporters who have knowledge or reasonable cause to know or suspect that a child or youth is the victim of dating violence or sexual assault. In these instances, mandatory reporters will be required to make a report within 72 hours. 66% yes, 33% no. Our additional comments, a little bit more comments here. Question 3, as it relates to Directive 7, Directive 11, which support the following recommendation. The question is seeking your position on the exact language below and does not include any caveats or additional considerations. Mandatory Reporting Task Force recommends removing victims advocate as defined in section X from the list of professions required to act as mandatory reporters. We do have a majority there as yes. And here are our comments. One second, sorry. Here we go. Can y'all see this again? All right, one second. Back up. Okay, cool. We were on question 4. Would you support a recommendation to keep victims advocates listed as mandatory reporter, but amend statute to clarify that victims advocates must only make reports when the victim's advocate has knowledge or reasonable cause to know or suspect that a child or youth is a victim of dating violence or sexual assault? Nearly 70% said no. Here are our comments. Moving on, question 5, as it relates to Directive 10, Mandatory Reporting Task Force recommends amending statute to clarify that mandatory reporters who are employed by an agent of or a contractor for an attorney who is providing legal representation are exempt from the reporting requirements. We had a unanimous yes on that one. Couple of pieces of feedback here, which we can consider in the writing, so appreciate that. Any questions? Any surprises? Any thoughts there? Curious or reactions? Just kind of curious what folks think based on what we just saw. This is just, I'm just curious where your brain's at.
This is Gina. I just want to comment that it's interesting that folks can get on board with the attorneys and legal folks, but still have conflicts with advocates. I think that we share similar privilege and relationship with folks that we serve. So I think that's very interesting. I think it opens up, I think, some more possibilities moving forward in terms of that. But yeah, I just wanted to remark on how that's very interesting to me.
Thanks, Gina. Jennifer and then Stephanie.
I actually am just going to respond to what Gina was saying. So attorneys are not mandatory reporters. In fact, attorneys can't report. So it looks really different than it does for advocates. And I understand why is everybody in support of people who work for attorneys not being reporters, but only 2/3 of people are in support of advocates not being reporters. But I think it's a very different question from my perspective.
Stephanie, then Kevin.
Yeah, I just wanted to really more clarify those slides, Trace, and the group voted that the advocates should be removed entirely from statute. Am I correct on that?
Yes.
Okay, and yet there were those caveats, and that's what Jennifer and Gina are referring to versus the attorney slide, which was 100% in support. Is that what? Yeah, thanks, Jen. Okay, I was just trying to clarify the comments. I just want to make sure I read the vote right.
I had the same question because I was like, wait, but people did. So there is still majority. Yes.
Yeah.
I think Gina, you're referencing just because there was 100% versus like 70%. Yeah. So just more of like a reflection than but yes, still passed. There was just a little bit more dissent on those groups.
Thank
So
you. That's all I wanted. Thank you.
yep. Kevin? And
Yeah,
then
I
we're going to move back. Jordan, are you ready? Okay, cool. So then we'll move back.
just to Gina's point, I wanted to clarify my answer, which was a yes, but in the comments, caveat that only in lieu of an exemption, that the exemption. So I think like the numbers could even, if you would look and make sure that the nuances picked up, because the question was asked a little bit trickier, because I would not say no to something, but I really prefer, right? I guess I would not say yes to something unless there was an exception. I don't know. It's confusing for me. I apologize.
No, apologize. All right, well, or Jordan, go ahead.
No, I just wanted, so Kevin, just to clarify, we really tried to get those questions in isolation so we could consider them in isolation. That's why we broke them down that way. But just wanted to open up to any questions people had about the survey in that light. But we did that intentionally because, right, we were kind of blending like, yes, exemption to, but no. So the questions were asked solely as written, standalone, yes or no. So I just wanted to make sure everyone was kind of clear on that and the intention behind it, because it's a little bit tricky for us to try and write a recommendation if we're not sure sit on different components.
Yeah, I'm 100% for the exemption.
Okay. That's helpful. Thank you. I just want to make sure I understood.
Perfect. All right. Well, yeah, I really appreciate and Ashley, appreciate your question. So we'll compile all of those just as like a pre-read for folks too, of like to know where the groups have been, because the other group has also been surveyed on a variety of things. And then that way you can kind of see, where those nuances, those caveats are. And then again, we'll be bringing this back to the full group for discussion, but we do want the larger group to understand, like, here's what this group was wrestling with, and here's ultimately where they landed, so that hopefully the things that the full group is able to push forward are reflective of the group that they really was able to dig in and do the work on it. Jennifer, I'll come to you, and then I'm going to bring us back because we do want to take this quick poll before going back for public comment. Go ahead, Jennifer.
I just wanted to flag that the questions that were about teen dating violence and sexual assault seem to, I'm just going to say, kind of miss the point of where I thought we needed to talk about those issues. The questions that really come up are if there is teen dating violence, right? There is a relationship between two peers. Should someone report that as child abuse? If there is sexual assault, not sexual assault, a sexual relationship, I guess, between two peers that would not meet our statutory rape definition, does that get reported as sexual assault of a child? I think we have a lot of confusion around those questions. You get to college age kids, and you've got some kids who are 17 and some who are 18 and 19 and older, and folks in universities don't know whether they're supposed to report, and somebody at college shouldn't be reported on just because they're 17 and turn 18 in December or whatever. So I wonder if we need to have more of a conversation about that issue that narrows in on those questions rather than the way the questions were phrased in this survey.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. That's a great point. We phrase them definitively to mimic the language in the directive, because we have to answer the question in the directive. So we took that language expressly from the directive so we could at least answer where we were falling here. Just keep in mind a couple of things. First and foremost, everyone is going to, when I mean everyone, I mean the whole group, not only in our discussions next week, but when we come back in August and October, everyone is going to see the final recommendations and have a chance to vote. I also just want to stress that every conversation we've had as a group here, where we have had in-depth discussions about why those delays may not be sufficient, we have lots of comments on those, that's also going to be included. So these surveys, I just really want to stress, they're just for us to make sure we have a general idea on, if I have to ask you a yes or no, which sometimes I do, so I know how to write the recommendation, I can go this way or that way, particularly if I have to address the directive itself. But I just want to assure everyone, all the conversations we're having here will be captured in detail, and the issues will be presented. So if we want to come back, we definitely can. We're going to have to do that very quickly so we can start writing. But again, I don't want everyone here to feel like we're just going to narrow in on this one question and that's all we're going to present. That's certainly not the intention here. I just wanted to make sure we could move forward in finding effective ways to address the directive in statute.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jordan. I think that's always I'll just say, from like someone who facilitates a lot of task forces with a lot of directives, that's always the challenge, is like it's never, you never fit neatly into the directive, and there's always additional conversation. And so I think the thing I really appreciate around how things have been written thus far from the CPO team is capturing the nuances, the caveats there, the additional questions, but also ensuring that we are doing our due diligence around the directive as it's written. And that's the challenge. So appreciate you bringing that up, Jennifer. Stephanie, and then I'm going to bring us back to the poll, and then we're going to go back to the group.
Great. I just have a question procedurally, Jordan and Trace. I know that the recommendations of the subcommittee will go to the larger group, and then the larger group will vote on them. I guess my question or concern is this group on our issues, we have struggled and talked and challenged and brainstormed and revised and reworked for hours and hours and hours. And so I guess my concern, and I know we need to have a full vote, but my only concern is, like, let's just take the victim or the advocate issue, which is one that has really taken time. How much time does the full group get to hear the recommendation and the reasons behind it? Because honestly, so many of these things are gut reaction. I'll just speak for myself. My initial response to an issue has changed in light of the hours we have spent together. So I guess I'm just a little concerned, like, how do we preserve the integrity of the work this group did?
Absolutely.
That's my question, I guess.
No, and Trace, I'm happy to address that if that's okay.
Yeah.
Great. Trace is like, please.
I'll add to it, because I have my own, I'll say, experience in groups where we've done subcommittees, brought folks back together. And I think, yeah. So Jordan, curious to hear your thoughts, and then, yeah.
No, thank you. So this is a great opportunity to talk process. The large group discussion on these recommendations next week is far, far, far from the final discussion on these issues. I don't even know, really, honestly, at this point, if we intend to take a vote on language on recommendations for these issues at our meeting next week. We're going to put some language together to respond to. The intention behind that is, okay, let us hear what the full group has to say. How are we responding? Give this subcommittee an opportunity to share the conversations and discussions. And then you all probably noticed that, we're going to take a big break between August and October. And the intention behind that is to give us a chance at the CPO and Keystone to catch up with the writing, to really sit and look at every meeting transcript, every recording, what we've discussed, every survey, put together information, and then represent proposed, and I'm going to stress again, proposed recommendations back to the group for the final report. We're not going to sit and do all those in one. We're going to divide them out so that per directive, again, there's conversation space. We can talk about where we struggled. We can make sure we're capturing those nuances, and then we'll take a final vote on those recommendations. Again, not looking for consensus, but looking for feedback and working from there. So I guess all I'm trying to say is that our meeting next week, when we present this to a large group, is not the last meeting. It won't be the only chance to provide feedback and insight on these. You're going to see a lot of surveys between now and October. Please provide your insight, your feedback, your comments. What does this look like? The effort to get through next week is just, honestly, we have to start writing. We have to start compiling this and getting in a report, which is why we're pushing kind of hard to have some back-to-back meetings to get us in a posture at the CPO and Keystone to do that. But there will be tons and tons of opportunities for feedback, discussion, debate on where these recommendations are landing. And then again, all that will be captured. Additionally, if there is dissent still to the recommendation that hits majority vote, everyone here will be given an opportunity to present why they disagree with the recommendation, move forward, and we will present that language verbatim in the final report. So trying to create a lot of checks and balances to capture voice and position on these recommendations. And Trace, hopefully I didn't say anything now that you have to feel like we're
No, I was just gonna say it, and then I'll just come in with a strong arm and be yeah. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen a larger group go against what a subcommittee. I think it's more capturing the nuances of like, did you guys think about this? Or I'm still really, but like I do think a group typically, at least that I've seen, and also you have to remember, again, I think it's important for subcommittees, and I'll say this to you all, and I'll say this to the other group, which is if this is the majority of where your subcommittee has landed, to just remember that, because something has to move forward one way or another. And so, you vote how you are most comfortable, and also recognizing that there's been a lot of push and pull to get to the point that we're at of what the recommendations are written as. So, and again, I think that a well-written report capturing the caveats, the nuances, that sort of thing, typically can get people to a comfortable place to vote and say, yes, we are comfortable with the majority on this, though we do have specific questions. So it's a totally fair question. All right. So Jordan, hit us with the poll. And then let's get over. Yeah.
this is not the strongest
Blow
language.
our minds with the language you came up with. And
it's
then
a little off the cuff, so just forgive me. It actually takes Brian and I several hours to write poll questions, so I'm not going to say it's the strongest work. I've divided it into 2 questions. The first question is, do you agree that we should present, just making very clear, a narrative of our discussion around the issue, not a recommendation, but a narrative addressing the issues highlighted here today?
All right, so we'll read that question and then do your digital hand if you are a yes. For those in favor. Jill gave the temporary thumb and the hard hand. We love to see it. Making a note of Tara as well.
Sorry, did I do something wrong? I'm supposed to raise my hand to say yes, right?
Yeah, no, Sam, you're good. You're good, Sam.
Okay.
I see your hand.
All right, I thought I might have done it wrong.
I missed the question. I'm not good at auditory questions. Sorry, can you say it again?
It's in the chat. So
Okay.
yeah, do you agree that the task force should present a general narrative detailing this group's discussions around the complexity of medical neglect? This narrative will include discussions around the disparate impacts of this issue on communities of color, people with disabilities, and under-resourced communities.
So one quick change, it should be medical child abuse, not medical neglect.
Thank you, Dr.
Yep.
Wells.
All right, lower hands there. Looked like I saw Tara and Sam with their hands up, so that'd be, I believe, 100%. Zane, did you have your hand up? Yeah, okay, cool. All right, folks could lower their hands now. And Jordan with 100% consensus on that. I think we can move to the second question. So I'll just read it out loud. Do you agree that in response to the directive to analyze medical child abuse, the task force will not issue a recommendation to change statute? Instead, the task force's response will clarify that the issue of reporting medical child abuse has been addressed in other directives. If you're in agreement, please raise your hand. All right. Thanks, Chris. Seeing full agreement there. I think we're good. All right, y'all. I'm gonna close this real quick. let's head back to the main group for a quick public comment, and then we'll get you out of here on time. Thank you so much for a great discussion today. Really appreciate y'all. Link is in the chat. We'll see you back for a moment and then send you on your way.
I don't have a leave button.
Oh, you just need to click the link in the chat. It'll automatically pop you over.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. Did he give you an option, Stephanie, to leave?